The grease was popping when she cracked the first egg. She never read an ingredient label, never had to. But somewhere between her kitchen and yours, the food changed. What she cooked by hand, factories learned to fake with chemistry. Here are 30 old American cooking tricks that are banned in other countries. Chlorine-washed chicken started as an efficiency trick in American slaughterhouses. A fast chemical bath at the end of the line to kill bacteria like salmonella before the bird ever reached a grocery store cooler. The European Union banned the practice in 1997, not because of the chlorine itself, but because of what it was covering up. EU regulators argued that dousing a carcass in antimicrobial solution gave processors permission to skip the harder work of keeping facilities clean from the start. In European poultry plants, only water touches the bird after slaughter. The hygiene has to happen before that point, with cleaner barns and slower processing lines. American processors chose speed over sanitation, and the chlorine rinse became the fix nobody questioned. Your grandmother bought a chicken from a farmer down the road, plucked it herself if she had to, and knew exactly where that bird had been. The old cooks could smell when something was off. No chemical bath required. Potassium bromate is a fine white powder that American bakers have been adding to dough for decades. It makes bread rise higher, bake faster, and come out with a bright white crumb that looks clean and uniform on a shelf. More than 100 commercial bread products in the United States still contain it. The United Kingdom, Canada, China, India, Brazil, and every country in the European Union banned potassium bromate after the International Agency for Research on Cancer classified it as a possible human carcinogen linked to kidney tumors and thyroid damage. The old bread makers never needed it. They kneaded by hand, let the dough rest overnight, and knew by the feel of it. The stretch, the spring, the weight in their palms, when it was ready. You did not rush bread, you earned it. The bromate was never about making better bread, it was about making faster bread, and the countries that said no decided the shortcut was not worth the risk. The bright red of a maraschino cherry, the electric yellow of boxed macaroni, the rainbow inside a handful of breakfast cereal, none of those colors come from food. Red 40, yellow 5, and yellow 6 are petroleum-based synthetic dyes, manufactured from the same raw material that makes asphalt and gasoline. Norway and Austria banned them entirely. The European Union requires a warning label on every product that contains them. A printed notice telling parents these dyes may cause adverse effects on attention and activity in children. No such label exists in the United States. American food companies like Kraft and Kellogg quietly reformulate their products for European shelves, swapping synthetic dyes for beetroot extract, paprika, and turmeric, then sell the original petroleum-colored version back home without a word. The same box of cereal, 2 different recipes, one for countries that demanded better, one for the country that did not ask. Before the hormones, a dairy cow gave what she gave. Your grandmother knew her milk came from a barn down the road, and nobody injected anything into those animals to make them produce more. Recombinant bovine somatotropin, RBST, is a synthetic growth hormone designed to push dairy cows beyond their natural output, sometimes increasing production by 15% per animal. Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and every nation in the European Union banned it. The concerns ran deeper than the hormone itself. Cows treated with RBST developed higher rates of mastitis, a painful udder infection that contaminates milk with pus and requires heavy antibiotics to treat. More drugs in the cow meant more residue in the glass. American dairy producers were not required to disclose its use. The woman who poured your cereal milk every morning trusted that someone was watching. Nobody was. If the hormones in the milk did not bother you, the drugs in the pork should have. Ractopamine is a beta-agonist feed additive, originally developed for asthma treatment, that American pig farmers began mixing into feed to force animals to pack on lean muscle in their final weeks before slaughter. It makes the meat leaner and the operation cheaper, and roughly 80% of American pigs were fed the drug at its peak. 160 countries banned it, including the entire European Union, China, Russia, and Taiwan. The only significant human study ever conducted involved 6 men. 3 developed heart palpitations so severe that one had to be pulled from the trial. Iowa hog farmer Brian Carwall tried ractopamine and stopped, saying the pigs turned hyper, climbing on top of each other in the corners of the barn. Your grandfather raised pigs on scraps and open ground. Those animals never needed a drug to grow. In 2012, a USDA microbiologist named Gerald Zernstein sent an email to colleagues calling it nasty pink slime, and the phrase stuck. The real name was lean, finely textured beef, trimmings scraped from bones, spun through centrifuges to remove fat, then blasted with ammonia gas to kill bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. At the time, roughly 70% of ground beef sold in American supermarkets contained this filler, and none of it was labeled. The European Union and Canada banned ammonia-treated beef entirely. The USDA approved the process in 2001 and agreed with the manufacturer that ammonia was a processing agent, not an ingredient, so it never appeared on a package. Your family bought ground beef and thought they were getting ground beef. The old butchers ground their meat fresh. You watched them do it, the chuck going through the grinder right in front of you. You knew what you were eating because you saw it happen. Azotocarbonamide sounds like something from a chemistry lab because it is. This synthetic compound whitens flour and strengthens dough in American breads, burger buns, tortillas, and frozen dinners. It also happens to be the same chemical used as a foaming agent in the production of yoga mats and shoe soles. Australia, the United Kingdom, and the entire European Union banned it from food over a decade ago, linking it to respiratory problems and asthma in workers exposed during manufacturing. Singapore made using it in food a criminal offense, up to 15 years in prison. The FDA still classifies it as safe in small quantities. American bread once rose on nothing but flour, water, yeast, and patience. The dough conditioner replaced the patience, and nobody told you what you lost. Open a box of cereal from the 1970s, and the ingredient list reads like a grocery receipt: wheat, sugar, malt, salt. Open one today, and somewhere near the bottom, you find BHA or BHT, 2 synthetic preservatives added to keep fats from going rancid on the shelf. Butylated hydroxyanisole and butylated hydroxytoluene sit in American breakfast cereals, instant potatoes, stuffing mixes, chewing gum, and butter. Japan, the United Kingdom, and much of the European Union banned or severely restricted both after studies linked them to tumor growth in animals and potential interference with blood clotting. Pillsbury pie crusts, stovetop stuffing, frosted flakes, all reformulated for international shelves, all sold with the original recipe at home. The old kitchens had a simpler method. They cooked what they had, ate it that week, and started fresh. Nothing sat on a shelf long enough to need a chemical to keep it from turning. Brominated vegetable oil was originally developed as a flame retardant. In 1958, American soda makers discovered it could keep citrus flavoring from separating in beverages and began adding it to drinks like Mountain Dew, Squirt, and Sundrop. For decades, it sat on the FDA's generally recognized as safe list until it was quietly removed in 1970. But instead of banning it, the agency allowed continued use in small amounts. Japan and the entire European Union banned BVO outright. Bromine accumulates in body tissue over time, and researchers linked it to memory loss and nerve damage. PepsiCo announced in 2014 that it would remove BVO from Mountain Dew, but the ingredient lingered in smaller brands for years. Your grandmother made lemonade with a pitcher, 3 lemons, sugar, and cold water. She never needed a flame retardant to hold the flavor together. It cost Procter & Gamble $200 million to develop Olestra, a fat substitute that promised Americans they could eat potato chips without guilt. Marketed as Olean, it was approved by the FDA in 1996 and put into Frito-Lay's Wow line of fat-free chips. The problem showed up fast. Nearly 4,000 complaints flooded the FDA. Cramping, digestive distress, and a side effect so infamous it earned its own warning label. Canada and the United Kingdom banned it. The European Union refused to approve it. Time magazine named Olestra one of the 50 worst inventions ever made. Sales dropped from 400 million to 200 million in 2 years. The chips were rebranded, then quietly pulled from shelves entirely. That whole era of fat-free food was built on the same lie, that chemistry could replace what your grandmother did with a cast-iron skillet and real ingredients. If Olestra was the industry's loudest failure, trans fats were its quietest killer. Partially hydrogenated oils, the process of pumping hydrogen gas through vegetable oil to make it solid at room temperature, gave American kitchens Crisco in 1911 and changed the way the country baked for the next century. Denmark became the first nation to restrict them in 2003. Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, and Iceland followed. The United States did not issue its own ban until 2018, 15 years after the science was settled. In those years between, trans fats sat in every pie crust, every stick of margarine, every deep fryer, and every diner and school cafeteria in the country. Your grandmother used lard she rendered herself, animal fat from the same pig she helped butcher in the fall. When the industry replaced her lard with a factory-made solid, it called the switch progress. The heart disease that followed told a different story. Wild salmon gets its pink from eating krill and shrimp. Natural astaxanthin builds up in the flesh over a lifetime of feeding in open water. Farmed salmon, raised in crowded pens on grain pellets and antibiotics, develops flesh that is naturally gray. To fix this, American fish farms add synthetic astaxanthin, a petrochemical manufactured in a lab, to the feed. The fish absorb the dye, and by the time the fillet reaches the grocery case, it looks wild-caught. Australia and New Zealand banned the sale of salmon colored with synthetic astaxanthin. Some European producers use it under much stricter disclosure requirements. In the United States, no mandatory label tells you whether your salmon was dyed. The old fishermen sold what they caught, and the color told you the truth: dark sockeye from Alaskan rivers, pale coho from the coast. If you knew fish, you could read the flesh. Now the flesh lies, and nobody corrects it. Arsenic was added to American chicken feed on purpose. Not by accident, not as contamination, as an ingredient. Roxarsone, an arsenic-based drug manufactured by a Pfizer subsidiary, was mixed into poultry feed to kill intestinal parasites, speed up growth, and give raw chicken a pinker appearance under grocery store lights. The European Union banned arsenic compounds in animal feed in 1999. The United States kept using them for another 12 years until Johns Hopkins researchers confirmed inorganic arsenic, a recognized carcinogen, was showing up in packaged chicken at levels consumers never agreed to eat. Decades of arsenic-laced poultry litter had already been spread across American cropland as fertilizer and even fed back to beef cattle. The old farm women raised birds on kitchen scraps, cracked corn, and whatever the chickens scratched from the yard. Nobody needed a poison to make the meat look right. Every fall, your mother picked apples that bruised if you looked at them wrong. She peeled them fast, cut out the brown spots, and whatever was left went into the pie. American apple growers found a chemical solution to that bruising, diphenylamine, or DPA, a post-harvest spray applied in storage warehouses to prevent the skin from browning during months of cold storage. The European Union banned DPA-treated apples in 2014 after studies suggested the chemical breaks down into nitrosamines, a class of compounds linked to cancer. American regulators considered the residue levels safe. EU officials were not convinced and shut the door. The gap between those two decisions sits on every apple in your grocery store, a thin, invisible film of chemistry that keeps the fruit looking perfect long after it should have shown its age. Your mother never needed a spray. She just cooked fast and wasted nothing, and a brown spot never stopped her once. Not every banned ingredient hides in obvious places. Some sit in the foods you would never think to question. Carrageenan is extracted from red seaweed and used as a thickener in American ice cream, chocolate milk, deli meats, cottage cheese, and infant formula. It gives processed food a creamy texture without adding fat. The European Union banned carrageenan from infant formula and baby food after studies linked it to gastrointestinal inflammation and concerns about digestive damage with prolonged exposure. In the United States, it remains in hundreds of products with no restriction and no required warning. The old cooks thickened their ice cream base with egg yolks and heavy cream, stirred it by hand in a salt-packed wooden bucket, and cranked the handle until their arms gave out. That custard tasted like summer because it was summer: fresh cream, ripe fruit, and a little vanilla if you were lucky. You have probably eaten titanium dioxide this week without knowing it. This synthetic white pigment, the same compound used in house paint and sunscreen, sits inside American candy coatings, coffee creamers, frosting, and powdered donuts. It adds no flavor and preserves nothing. It just makes food whiter. France banned titanium dioxide from food in 2020. The European Union followed in 2022 after concluding it could no longer be considered safe, citing evidence of potential DNA damage from nanoparticle exposure. The FDA still allows it, and manufacturers can hide it behind the words artificial color on any label. Most Americans have no idea they are eating it. The old bakers never whitened a thing. Flour came in varying shades depending on the mill, and nobody sent back a biscuit for looking slightly yellow. Here is something your grandmother would have found hilarious. The same preservative in her lipstick and hand lotion is also in her grandchildren's tortillas. Propylparaben is an antimicrobial compound widely used in American cosmetics, and it doubles as a food preservative in trail mix, baked goods, corn tortillas, sausage casings, and flavored beverages. The European Union banned propylparaben from food in 2006 and from cosmetics by 2015, after research linked it to endocrine disruption and a possible connection to breast cancer cell growth. The United States allows it in both. Nobody in the old kitchens would have understood a chemical doing double duty between the bathroom cabinet and the bread box. They made tortillas with masa, water, lard, and salt, pressed flat on a hot comel, eaten within the hour. Nothing needed preserving because nothing lasted long enough to spoil. The sugar in your grandmother's kitchen came from cane that grew in southern fields and was cut by hand. The sugar in yours likely passed through a field sprayed with atrazine, one of the most heavily applied herbicides in American agriculture, used on corn, sugarcane, and sorghum to kill broadleaf weeds. 44 countries banned it. The European Union pulled atrazine from approved use in 2004 after finding it persistently contaminated groundwater and disrupted hormone activity in wildlife. Male frogs exposed in laboratory settings developed female reproductive organs. The United States still sprays roughly 70 million pounds annually across the Midwest and South. It runs off fields into rivers and wells and ends up in the tap water of farming communities that have been drinking it for decades. The old sugar was not clean because somebody tested it. It was clean because nobody had invented a reason to poison the soil yet. In 1970, almost every sweetened product in America used cane sugar or beet sugar. By 1985, high-fructose corn syrup had replaced sugar in nearly every major soft drink, bread, cereal, condiment, and canned good on the shelf. The switch happened because corn was cheap, government-subsidized, and the syrup blended into liquids more easily than granulated sugar. The European Union placed strict production quotas on high-fructose corn syrup for decades and limited its use to a fraction of what American manufacturers consume. Several countries imposed heavy tariffs or avoided it entirely. In the United States, it became so standard that finding a loaf of bread without it required reading every label in the aisle. Your grandmother sweetened with a sugar bowl on the counter. She measured by eye, tasted as she went, and knew when it was enough. She never poured from an industrial drum of corn-derived syrup. If the sweetener in the bread was hard to spot, the trick inside the meat package was invisible. American meat processors pump carbon monoxide into sealed packaging to react with myoglobin in beef, pork, and tuna, locking the flesh into a bright cherry red that can last for weeks, long past the point where the meat has begun to turn. The European Union banned the practice, arguing it deceives consumers by masking the visual cues of spoilage that have protected buyers for centuries. A steak that should look gray-brown after 5 days still looks fresh at 12. Japan and Singapore also restrict its use. In the United States, the FDA classified carbon monoxide packaging as generally recognized as safe, and no label discloses it. Your grandmother pressed her thumb into a cut of meat at the butcher counter and smelled it before she paid. She trusted her hands and her nose. Now the package does the lying for you. By 2020, more than 90% of American corn, soybeans, and cotton were genetically modified, engineered to resist herbicides or produce their own insecticides at the cellular level. The European Union banned cultivation of most GMO crops and required strict labeling on any imported food containing modified ingredients. Russia banned GMO cultivation and imports entirely. Dozens of nations across Africa, Asia, and South America imposed restrictions the United States resisted for years. American consumers had no federally mandated right to know whether their corn chips, soy milk, or cooking oil came from modified plants until a voluntary labeling standard appeared, designed to be as easy to miss as possible. The old farmers saved seed from one harvest to plant the next. The grain belonged to the land and the family. Now the seed belongs to a patent, and the farmer pays every season for the right to grow what the earth used to give for free. The bright pink of a hot dog, the rosy edge of deli ham, the deep red of pepperoni that holds its color for months, none of that is the meat's natural shade. Sodium nitrate and sodium nitrite have been used in American processed meats since the early 20th century, originally to prevent botulism, but increasingly to maintain color and shelf life. The European Union implemented strict new limits in 2023, cutting maximum allowable levels well below what the United States permits. The World Health Organization classified processed meat as a Group 1 carcinogen in 2015, the same category as tobacco. American hot dogs, bacon, and cured sausages still contain levels that would be illegal across the Atlantic. Your grandmother cured her own pork with salt, smoke, and thyme in a cold cellar. She never needed a chemical to keep the color honest. Red dye. Number 3, erythrocene, has been coloring American food since the 1950s. Fruit cocktail cups, candy hearts, strawberry-flavored drinks, cough syrups, gummy vitamins, popsicles, and cake decorations all carried that bright artificial pink for decades. The FDA banned it from cosmetics in 1990 after animal studies showed it caused thyroid tumors in rats, then announced its intention to pull it from food as well. And then nothing happened. For over 30 years, the agency stalled while the dye stayed in the food supply. The European Union restricted red dye long before the United States acted. It was not until January of 2025 that the FDA finally revoked authorization, and even then, manufacturers were given years to reformulate. Your grandmother colored her frosting with beet juice and berry syrup. The pink was never as bright, but it came from something she could name. The potatoes in your grandmother's root cellar sprouted by February. She cut the eyes out with a paring knife, boiled what was left, and never thought twice. The potatoes in your grocery store sit for months without a single sprout, and that is not an accident. Chlorpropham is a chemical sprout inhibitor applied to stored potatoes across the United States to extend shelf life through the winter. The European Union banned it in 2020 after residue testing showed persistent traces even after washing and cooking, with toxicological reviews raising concerns about thyroid interference. European producers switched to cold storage methods. American warehouses kept spraying. The old root cellars were dark, cool, and dug into the earth. Potatoes lasted months on nothing but the right temperature. When they sprouted, you trimmed them and cooked them anyway. The last few tricks are not about a single dish or ingredient. They are about the moment American kitchens stopped trusting what was in the food and started hoping someone else was checking. Routine antibiotics in animal feed began in the 1950s, when researchers discovered that low doses of penicillin and tetracycline made livestock gain weight faster. By the 2000s, roughly 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States were going to healthy animals, chickens, pigs, and cattle that showed no signs of illness. The European Union banned routine use of antibiotics as growth promoters in 2006. The World Health Organization warned that overuse in agriculture was accelerating antibiotic-resistant bacteria. American regulators asked producers to voluntarily cut back. Your grandmother's chickens never saw a veterinarian. They lived outside, ate bugs and grain, and either thrived or they did not. Pick up an apple at the grocery store and run your thumb across the skin. That slick, shiny surface is not the fruit. It is a coating. American produce is commonly treated with food-grade wax made from shellac, carnauba, or petroleum-based compounds to replace the natural wax that gets scrubbed off during post-harvest washing. The coating seals in moisture, extends shelf life, and makes the fruit gleam under fluorescent lights. The European Union restricts several of the chemical wax formulations allowed in the United States, and some synthetic coatings used on American apples and citrus do not meet EU food contact standards. Your grandmother picked fruit from a tree in the yard or bought it from a stand where the dust was still on the skin. She wiped it on her apron and handed it to you warm. It was not shiny, it was not perfect. But you ate it standing in the kitchen before she could tell you to wash your hands. The real maraschino cherry was a small sour marasca cherry from Croatia, preserved in maraschino liqueur and served as a delicacy across Europe for centuries. The American version is a different thing entirely, a sweet cherry bleached with calcium chloride and sulfur dioxide until it turns completely white, then soaked in high-fructose corn syrup and red 40 until it becomes that unnaturally bright red on top of sundaes and inside Shirley Temples. Austria, France, Finland, Norway, and the United Kingdom banned the American version because of the synthetic dye. The cherry your grandmother dropped into a glass of ginger ale at a church social was already that fake red. She did not know what was in it, and nobody told her. She just thought it looked festive. The original, the real one, preserved in liqueur and eaten slowly, vanished from American tables so long ago that most people never knew it existed. Velveeta was invented in 1918 by a Swiss immigrant cheesemaker in Monroe, New York, who found a way to use broken and leftover wheels by melting them together with whey. What started as a practical fix for waste became a product so far removed from cheese that multiple countries refused to let it carry the name. In many European nations, Cheez Whiz, Kraft Singles, and Velveeta do not meet the legal definition of cheese. Too many emulsifiers, too little actual dairy. They must be labeled cheese product or cheese food. Your grandmother made pimento cheese by hand. Sharp cheddar she grated herself, roasted pimentos from a jar, a little mayonnaise, and enough cayenne to make you pay attention. It was real cheese from a real block, and she never would have recognized what came wrapped in plastic. The smell of movie theater popcorn, that warm, overwhelmingly buttery blast that hits you before you reach the counter, comes from a chemical called diacetyl. This synthetic flavoring was used in microwave popcorn, margarine, and snack seasonings for decades. Then the workers started getting sick. Employees at popcorn plants developed a severe irreversible lung condition known as popcorn lung, bronchiolitis obliterans, from breathing diacetyl vapor on the production line day after day. The European Union restricted diacetyl in occupational settings and tightened food use rules. American manufacturers quietly removed it after lawsuits, but no federal ban followed. Your grandmother melted real butter in a saucepan and poured it over popcorn. She shook in a covered pot on the stove. The smell filled the whole house. Every bit of it was real. Behind every trick on this list sits one quiet loophole that made them all possible. In 1958, the United States created a classification called Generally Recognized as Safe, GRAS, intended to let common ingredients like vinegar and black pepper into the food supply without formal testing. Over the decades, the industry stretched that loophole until it barely held. Companies hired their own scientists to declare new chemicals safe without ever submitting findings to the FDA. The European Union requires proof an additive is safe before it reaches a shelf. The United States lets companies decide for themselves. That is the distance between your grandmother's kitchen and yours. She did not need a regulation to know what was safe. She knew because she grew it, raised it, or watched her neighbor do the same. The food was honest then. The hands that made it were honest. And somewhere between there and here, we let strangers decide what to feed us. Homemade TV dinner trays were a clever 1960s trick that let families enjoy the novelty of frozen meals without buying expensive store-bought versions. Moms used foil pans to portion leftovers into single servings, freezing them so they could be reheated later. This not only reduced food waste, but also gave busy families quick meals ready for hectic nights. Before microwaves were common, these trays were reheated in the oven, making dinner convenient and organized. For kids, it felt special to have their own individual tray with compartments just like the TV dinners advertised on television. Parents appreciated the savings, since making their own trays cost far less than buying prepackaged meals. It was also a way to stretch Sunday roasts or large batches of stew into multiple dinners during the week. Homemade TV dinners reflected the spirit of the decade, balancing modern convenience with frugal practicality. They stand as an example of how 1960s moms used resourcefulness to give their families the best of both worlds. The cheese ball party trick was a revelation in its time, and no holiday table was complete without one. Housewives mixed cream cheese with dried beef, scallions, or herbs, rolled it into a sphere, and coated it in chopped nuts to give it flair. It looked extravagant, but in truth it was inexpensive, easy, and endlessly adaptable. A few simple ingredients transformed into a showpiece that impressed neighbors and entertained guests. It became a centerpiece of cocktail parties with crackers lined neatly around it, and guests breaking off pieces as if it were something gourmet. The trick was that it could be made hours or even a day in advance, saving time for the host. Housewives loved anything that made them look polished without spending too much money or labor. It was not just cheese, it was social confidence shaped into a ball. The 70s were full of gatherings, and this recipe proved that you did not need wealth to make a statement. Cornmeal mush was one of those dishes that seemed too plain to matter, yet it carried families through some of the hardest years of the 20th century. Cornmeal was cheap, easy to store, and available almost everywhere, making it a perfect staple for kitchens that had to make a little go a long way. Mothers would stir cornmeal into boiling water until it thickened into a soft porridge that could be served plain, sweetened with molasses, or salted and fried the next morning. Fried slices of cornmeal mush were especially popular because they crisped beautifully and tasted rich without costing much. Families ate it for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else was in the pantry. Sometimes gravy was poured on top to make it feel like a proper supper, especially when meat was absent. The dish did not need much imagination to prepare, but it carried the weight of survival by being endlessly adaptable and nourishing. It was proof that even the simplest grain could keep a family fed when there was no money for flour or bread. Tang as a breakfast staple was one of the most memorable 1960s tricks for families looking for an affordable way to brighten the morning. Fresh orange juice was expensive and often impractical to keep in the refrigerator, but Tang offered an instant alternative in powdered form. With just a spoonful of powder and water, moms could serve a bright, sweet drink that felt modern and fun. It promised vitamins, energy, and a futuristic touch thanks to its association with astronauts, which made kids love it even more. Parents liked it because it saved money and time, offering the illusion of a wholesome breakfast beverage without the high cost of fresh juice. Tang became part of morning routines across the country, a symbol of the way convenience foods reshaped family life in the 1960s. For many, it was not just a drink, but a memory of rushing out the door for school with something sweet in hand. It was clever marketing and cleverer parenting rolled together, and it remains one of the most iconic examples of 1960s breakfast ingenuity. Leftover meatloaf sandwiches were nothing fancy, but they were a weekday miracle in 70s homes. Housewives knew that one meatloaf could stretch across several meals if handled wisely, and cold slices tucked between bread made school lunches go further. A slab of meatloaf with ketchup on white bread kept kids full, while thinner slices paired with mustard and onion became work lunches for husbands. It was not wasteful, it was resourceful, and everyone felt like they got something different, even though it was the same dish. Housewives often cooked meatloaf in bigger batches for exactly this reason, knowing that leftovers were not a burden but a solution. Sandwiches transformed last night's dinner into today's lunch, which was a small act of clever planning. Families saved money without ever feeling like they were missing out on fresh food. It was frugality disguised as convenience, which is why it stayed popular through the decade. The satisfaction of pulling a ready slice from the fridge and creating a meal in seconds was the reward for thinking ahead. Cabbage stretchers in stews were another clever trick because one head of cabbage could turn a thin pot of soup into something that looked and felt like a feast. Meat was often the most expensive part of a dish, and for poor families, it was rationed out in the smallest amounts. By chopping cabbage into hearty chunks and tossing it into the pot, the stew suddenly had volume, fiber, and bulk that gave the impression of generosity even when there was very little meat inside. The cabbage would soak up the broth and carry the flavor of the bones or scraps that had been simmering for hours. Families leaned on this method heavily in the Depression era and during wartime because it meant no one walked away hungry, even if the protein was scarce. The sweet and soft cabbage mingled with potatoes, onions, or carrots to create something simple but deeply comforting. It might not have been glamorous, but it kept bellies warm through long winters. Stretching meat this way was the difference between a family meal and a disappointing half-empty pot. The boxed cake mix plus pudding trick was one of the clever shortcuts 1960s moms swore by to make store-bought mixes taste homemade. Boxed cakes were affordable and convenient, but they often lacked the richness of scratch baking. The solution was to stir a packet of instant pudding mix into the batter, which added moisture, depth, and a tender crumb that stayed soft for days. Chocolate cakes became richer, vanilla cakes more fragrant, and even fruit-flavored mixes seemed more indulgent. This little hack quickly spread by word of mouth and appeared in countless community cookbooks because it was simple, affordable, and guaranteed success. Kids loved the texture, dads praised the flavor, and moms were relieved that they could deliver bakery-quality cakes with little effort. It was the kind of trick that made every birthday party, potluck, or Sunday dessert feel just a bit more special without costing extra time or money. Even decades later, bakers still use this 1960s secret to give boxed cakes an upgrade, proof of just how clever and enduring the trick really was. Miracle Whip salad dressing was a secret weapon in fruit salads and slaws, offering a tangy sweetness that regular mayonnaise lacked. Housewives relied on it when they wanted to make dishes stand out without adding expensive ingredients. Grapes, apples, or shredded cabbage tasted brighter when dressed in it, turning simple produce into something special. It became the dressing of choice for picnics and church suppers, with recipes passed around between friends. The balance of sweet and tangy fooled people into thinking it was a unique family recipe, even though it came straight from a jar. It was affordable, easy, and dependable, which was exactly what busy households needed. Miracle Whip was not just a condiment, it was a kitchen trick to make ordinary dishes taste fresh. It is the kind of thing that made 70s cooking feel both practical and playful at once. The drippings jar was a permanent fixture in poor families' kitchens, often sitting right by the stove. Anytime bacon, pork, or beef was cooked, the leftover fat was carefully poured into the jar rather than thrown away. That fat became liquid gold, used to fry potatoes, season vegetables, or spread on bread like butter. It brought depth of flavor to meals that otherwise would have tasted plain or thin. Families guarded their drippings jars fiercely because a spoonful of fat could transform scraps into something satisfying. It was also a way of honoring the idea that nothing from the animal should go to waste, not even the grease. In homes where butter was rare and expensive, drippings filled the role of fat in cooking and baking. Many children grew up associating the taste of bacon grease with comfort because it flavored so much of what they ate. For poor families, the drippings jar was less a choice and more a necessity that stretched their meals further than money alone could. Canned pineapple upside-down cake became one of the most iconic desserts of the 1960s because it turned something affordable and shelf-stable into a dish that looked glamorous. Fresh fruit was expensive for many families, but canned pineapple rings offered an affordable alternative that still delivered sweetness and tropical flair. Moms arranged the golden slices in neat circles, added bright maraschino cherries in the middle, and poured cake batter over the top before baking. When flipped onto a platter, the caramelized pineapple and cherries created a show-stopping look that made the cake seem far fancier than it really was. It became a favorite for family gatherings, church suppers, and birthday celebrations because it was both economical and eye-catching. Children loved the sticky sweetness, while parents appreciated how easy it was to make using boxed cake mixes and pantry staples. The dish symbolized the 1960s trend of turning convenience foods into impressive centerpieces that still carried the warmth of homemade cooking. Moms knew that with a can of pineapple and a little creativity, they could serve something memorable without stretching the family budget too far. Iceberg lettuce boats looked like diet food, but they were actually a clever way to stretch expensive proteins. Housewives would hollow out big crisp leaves and fill them with cottage cheese, tuna salad, or chopped ham, making one head of lettuce feed a whole family. They appeared on diet plates in diners, but at home they were a showcase of thrift dressed up as something stylish. A tray of these boats made it seem like you had spent hours planning, when in reality it was just a matter of scooping and spooning. They were crisp, fresh, and cheap, which checked every box for a busy mother trying to keep meals interesting. Cottage cheese and canned fruit made them light enough for summer lunches, while ham or tuna made them hearty for a quick dinner. Guests thought they were trendy, kids thought they were fun, and husbands thought they were health conscious, which meant everyone went home happy. It was not about the lettuce at all. It was about the illusion that this was something fresh and new. That was the true genius of 70s cooking tricks, making ordinary food feel like a special creation. Dandelion green salad was the definition of making something out of nothing, because this food was plucked straight from yards, fields, and roadsides. Poor families knew that nature itself could provide when store shelves or wallets could not. Children were often sent outside with small baskets to gather bunches of the bitter greens, which were then washed carefully and dressed with a splash of vinegar or a sprinkle of salt. It was not glamorous, but it was fresh, and it came without a price tag. Many families swore by the health benefits of these wild greens because they offered vitamins that were otherwise hard to come by when diets were thin on fresh produce. The taste was sharp and earthy, but hunger made everything more welcome, and the salad filled a gap that could not be ignored. Eating what the land gave you, even if it was a weed, was a skill that kept countless households going during hard times. Stretching meatloaf with oatmeal was a trick that defined the frugal resourcefulness of 1960s kitchens. Ground beef was not always cheap, and feeding large families required a little ingenuity to make it go further. Moms discovered that stirring in rolled oats gave the mixture bulk, helping 1 pound of meat stretch into several hearty servings. The oats absorbed juices and flavors as the loaf baked, making the dish tender without watering it down. Kids rarely noticed the difference, especially when the loaf was topped with ketchup or tomato sauce that gave it familiar comfort. For many families, meatloaf night was a tradition, and the addition of oats made it affordable enough to keep that tradition alive week after week. It was not just about saving money. It was about preserving a sense of normalcy and abundance, even when budgets were tight. The trick was passed down through cookbooks and shared at neighborhood gatherings as a reliable way to make a meal feel complete without emptying the wallet. It remains a reminder that small substitutions can transform a single pound of meat into a dish that fed an entire table with pride. Waffle iron hash browns were the answer to crispy potatoes without the mess of frying. Shredded potatoes pressed into the iron crisped on both sides at once, freeing housewives from standing over a skillet with popping grease. It was neat, quick, and just inventive enough to feel like a brand new dish. The trick spread quickly through kitchens and community cookbooks, turning a breakfast staple into a gadget-driven shortcut. Kids loved the crisp edges, husbands appreciated the speed, and wives loved that the cleanup was minimal. It gave old waffle irons new life beyond breakfast, which was a welcome bit of resourcefulness. The result was golden, crunchy potatoes that looked just as appetizing as fried ones, but with far less fuss. A housewife in the 70s might not have had time for extra steps, but she had plenty of cleverness to spare. The waffle iron proved that appliances could double as problem solvers when you needed them most. Egg drop soup with watered stock was an old-world trick that became common in poor American households too. The base of the soup was usually just bones or thin broth that had already been stretched as far as possible. To make it feel substantial, a beaten egg was whisked in while the pot simmered, turning into ribbons of soft protein that thickened the liquid. It was cheap, fast, and filling, 3 words that defined survival cooking. Sometimes chopped scallions or leftover greens would be added, but the egg itself was the key to making it taste like a real dish instead of just flavored water. Poor families leaned on this recipe because it delivered nourishment without demanding many ingredients. It was a small act of ingenuity that made hunger easier to bear. Gelatin molded salads with hidden vegetables might sound unusual today, but in the 1960s, they were a clever way moms made sure no food went to waste. Boxes of flavored gelatin were cheap and endlessly versatile, and instead of just being used for dessert, they often became the centerpiece of family meals. Leftover peas, carrots, celery, or even shredded cabbage could be folded inside shimmering rings or layered molds to disguise them in a colorful, playful presentation. Kids who turned their noses up at boiled vegetables were much more likely to eat them when they were suspended in a fruity or savory gelatin creation. Some versions leaned sweet with canned fruit, while others leaned savory with mayonnaise or cottage cheese mixed in for texture. The molds themselves were part of the fun, shaped into rings or domes that looked festive on the dinner table. Moms knew that presentation mattered as much as flavor, and these creations turned scraps into something that felt almost special. It was thrift, creativity, and determination rolled into one, and though we might laugh at them today, they were once considered clever, modern, and a staple of 1960s kitchens. Oyster cracker toppers were one of those little tricks that 70s housewives leaned on to stretch both flavor and budget. Breadcrumbs were not always on hand, and store-bought toppings could be pricey or just out of reach, so oyster crackers became the solution. They were smashed or crushed and sprinkled over bubbling casseroles or stews, adding that extra crunch that made the dish feel complete. You might laugh at the idea today, but this was the kind of smart move that turned leftovers into something that felt like dinner instead of scraps. Kids would dig in without complaint, and husbands coming home from work thought it was just another fancy touch their wives had picked up. All it took was a small bag of crackers to dress up a whole pot of food, which meant one trip to the store could carry through an entire week of meals. They were also handy to keep around for soups, giving even the most basic broth that texture people craved. A clever cook in the 70s knew it was not about what you had, but what you could make it look and taste like. Potato pancakes were one of the most common ways poor families made use of leftovers because nothing could be wasted in a household that was barely scraping by. When a pot of mashed potatoes went cold and stiff the next morning, it did not go into the trash, but instead into a frying pan. Mothers would form little patties out of the mash, dust them with a light coat of flour, and fry them in a skillet until the edges were golden and crisp. The result was something hearty enough to feel like a fresh breakfast or even a side dish at supper. Kids thought of them as a treat because the sizzling sound in the pan promised something different from the plain boiled potatoes they often saw on the table. Potato pancakes were flexible too, and could be eaten plain with a sprinkle of salt or dressed up with a dollop of gravy if the family had any to spare. They were filling without requiring new ingredients, which was always the goal. This trick of repurposing cold mashed potatoes meant the family stretched a single meal into 2, and in times when every penny counted, that was survival. Bologna boat sandwiches were a playful invention that brought a little fun to lunchboxes and after-school snacks. Bologna was inexpensive and widely available, so moms looked for new ways to keep it interesting. By slicing a round of bologna and curving the edges, they created little cups or boats that could be filled with cheese, relish, or chopped vegetables. The result was a small, filling bite that felt more exciting than a plain sandwich. Kids loved the novelty of eating food shaped like boats, and moms appreciated that it was cheap, quick, and easy to prepare in batches. These little creations showed how 1960s moms understood the power of presentation in making ordinary ingredients feel special. They stretched lunches without adding cost and turned humble bologna into something memorable. Though they have disappeared from most tables today, they stand as a reminder that sometimes the cleverest kitchen tricks were also the simplest, making mealtimes just a bit more fun during a decade when families still gathered around the table every day. Mayonnaise chocolate cake sounds like the oddest pairing, but to a 70s housewife, it was a lifesaver. Eggs and oil were not always affordable or plentiful, and mayonnaise carried both of those ingredients in one neat jar. What might have started as a depression trick found new life in suburban kitchens where dessert could not be skipped. The mayo kept the cake moist and soft, which made it a reliable favorite even when pantry shelves looked bare. Housewives served it at birthday parties, neighborhood gatherings, and even slipped it into lunchboxes, and no one ever guessed the secret ingredient. The kids were thrilled, the neighbors thought it was genius, and all it took was one jar of mayonnaise. For a generation that had been raised on thrift and taught to make do, this was proof that simple pantry swaps could feel indulgent. It turned an ordinary chocolate cake into something special that lasted longer and stayed fresh even days later. What mattered was not telling anyone how it was made, because the taste spoke for itself. Bread pudding was born out of thrift and necessity, and it was one of the sweetest tricks poor families held on to during the lean years. When loaves of bread grew stale and too hard for sandwiches, mothers refused to toss them out. Instead, they soaked the cubes in milk, added a little sugar or molasses, and baked them until the dish puffed up golden brown. If eggs were available, they went in too, but the recipe worked with whatever could be spared. Raisins, cinnamon, or even scraps of leftover jam sometimes found their way into the mix to give it more character. The result was a dessert that felt indulgent without costing anything extra. For children, it was often the only sweet treat they saw in a week, and for parents, it was proof that resourcefulness could turn waste into joy. Bread pudding tasted like comfort, and more than that, it tasted like resilience. Crock-pot stews with budget cuts became a hallmark of clever 1960s cooking as slow cookers began finding their way into more households. Tougher cuts of meat that were cheaper at the butcher could be transformed into tender, flavorful meals after hours of slow simmering. Moms would add potatoes, carrots, onions, and broth, letting everything meld together while they went about their day. The result was a warm, hearty stew waiting by dinner time, made possible by a method that turned thrift into comfort. This trick saved money, reduced stress, and kept family meals consistent even in busy households. It also marked a shift toward modern appliances, making life easier while still honoring the tradition of cooking from scratch with what was available. Kids loved coming home to the smell of a crock-pot meal filling the house, and parents appreciated how far it stretched the grocery budget. Crock-pot stews with budget cuts were more than food, they were a sign of changing times, where clever tools and resourceful recipes kept families fed and happy. Canned green bean bundles were as much about presentation as they were about thrift. Housewives took humble canned beans, wrapped them with strips of bacon, and baked them into tidy little packages that looked far fancier than the ingredients suggested. Suddenly, the cheapest vegetable in the pantry became a party dish. They were easy to pick up, easy to serve, and they made families feel like they were dining in style. Kids who might have turned up their noses at plain beans were suddenly intrigued by the crispy bacon wrapping. It was one of those recipes that cost very little but carried big impact. Guests assumed it was a restaurant-inspired dish, not realizing it came straight from a can. Housewives kept these tricks up their sleeves to add flair without adding expense. They were little bites of ingenuity that showed just how far simple ingredients could be stretched when creativity came first. Casseroles with crushed potato chips on top might sound indulgent, but they were really a thrifty invention of clever 1960s moms. Instead of throwing away the crumbs at the bottom of a snack bag, they sprinkled them over casseroles as a crunchy topping. The chips added flavor, texture, and a golden crust that made even the simplest casserole feel exciting. Popular with tuna, chicken, or vegetable bases, the crunchy topping transformed leftovers and pantry staples into something families looked forward to. It was also a way of stretching expensive ingredients by making casseroles the star of the meal rather than a side dish. The trick appealed to kids who loved the fun of finding chips baked into dinner and reassured parents who wanted nothing to go to waste. The casserole itself became a canvas for creativity, but it was the potato chip topping that made it memorable. Moms of the 1960s proved that even the last crumbs from a snack bag could turn a basic family meal into comfort food with a touch of flair. Grape jelly meatballs sound strange, but in the 70s they were the darling of every cocktail party. Housewives simmered meatballs in a sauce made from grape jelly and chili, creating a sweet and savory flavor that felt completely new. Guests were surprised by the unusual pairing, but one taste kept them coming back. They became a staple of potlucks and gatherings, feeding a crowd with very little effort. The sauce was cheap, the meatballs could be stretched with fillers like breadcrumbs, and the result felt festive. Housewives loved how little time it took to put together, and partygoers remembered it long after the evening ended. It was another example of a clever trick making use of common pantry items to create something memorable. Even today, people who grew up in the 70s remember those saucy meatballs with nostalgia. It was proof that daring combinations could win hearts when money and time were short. Cabbage stretching ground beef dinners was a trick that spoke directly to the frugal heart of 1960s households. When a pound of beef was not enough to feed everyone, chopped cabbage was mixed in to bulk up dishes like skillet suppers, casseroles, or even soups. The cabbage softened as it cooked, soaking up flavor from the meat and seasonings, creating a dish that tasted heartier than it really was. This approach let moms serve generous portions while keeping grocery bills under control. It also provided extra nutrition, sneaking vegetables into meals that might otherwise have been light on greens. For kids, it often went unnoticed among the sauce and beef, while parents saw it as a clever way to make a single pound of meat stretch across an entire family dinner. This simple technique became a staple of Depression-era cooking and carried proudly into the 1960s, where thrift and tradition met modern convenience. It is one of those forgotten tricks that shows how a little cabbage could make all the difference when budgets were tight. Stuffed bell peppers with rice were the ultimate thrifty oven dish. Housewives stretched a small amount of ground meat by mixing it with rice, tomato sauce, and seasonings, stuffing it all into colorful peppers. What might have been only enough for two became a meal for an entire family. Baking them together let the flavors mingle, turning cheap ingredients into a dish that felt warm and complete. It was filling, economical, and surprisingly impressive when placed on the table. Housewives knew that recipes like this were about more than saving money. They were about creating meals that carried pride. It became a regular weeknight dinner that required very little but delivered a lot. Families walked away satisfied, and the kitchen stayed under budget. It was a shining example of how thrift and flavor met in perfect harmony in 70s kitchens. Adding marshmallows to sweet potatoes was one of the cleverest ways 1960s moms turned an everyday root into something that looked like it belonged on a holiday table. Sweet potatoes were inexpensive and plentiful, but they did not always excite children or picky eaters. The solution was to mash or slice them, season with a bit of butter or cinnamon if it was available, and then crown them with a handful of mini marshmallows. When baked, the marshmallows browned and melted into a gooey topping that added sweetness and charm. This little trick transformed a cheap vegetable into a dish that felt special enough for Thanksgiving, yet practical enough for an ordinary weeknight. Families loved it because it tasted like dessert and vegetable all in one, while moms valued how little effort or cost it required. It was a dish that bridged thrift and festivity, turning plain roots into something celebratory. Even if some saw it as unusual, it quickly became a tradition that brought warmth and excitement to countless tables across America. Pineapple upside-down bundt cake was one of those whimsical desserts that instantly caught attention on a 70s table. Housewives already knew the appeal of the classic pineapple upside-down cake, but baking it in a bundt pan gave it height, curves, and a presentation that seemed far fancier than the ingredients suggested. Canned pineapple rings, bright red cherries, and sticky brown sugar glaze lined the bottom of the mold, so when it was flipped out, it looked like something pulled straight from a magazine. Guests thought it was sophisticated, but the truth was it took no more effort than the original recipe. It was a playful nod to the growing trend of bundt pans in every kitchen, where recipes could be repurposed for new shapes and styles. Housewives leaned on this trick whenever they needed to impress without the fuss of pastries or layered cakes. The cake looked polished, tasted rich, and had the bonus of stretching one can of fruit into a dessert that fed a crowd. It was a dish that celebrated presentation as much as thrift, showing how far creativity could take you. Spam and pineapple skillet suppers were a tropical twist on the thrifty meals that defined the 1960s kitchen. Spam was cheap, filling, and shelf-stable, but it needed a little creativity to keep it interesting night after night. Moms found inspiration in Hawaiian flavors, slicing spam into cubes and browning them before adding canned pineapple chunks for sweetness. The pineapple cut through the saltiness of the spam, and when served over rice or noodles, it became a colorful, filling family dinner. This dish symbolized the way mid-century households embraced convenience foods while still searching for variety. It was inexpensive, it used pantry staples, and it carried just enough flair to feel adventurous. Kids loved the sweet and savory contrast, while parents appreciated how a single can of meat could be stretched into a full meal. Spam and pineapple skillet suppers showed how far a little canned fruit and processed meat could go when guided by ingenuity. Those kitchens fed families on trust, and we traded it for chemistry. Like and subscribe if you remember what real food tasted like.